Karen calls 911 when I refuse to give her keys to my house. You ever feel like life throws you into situations you never signed up for, and the only thing you can do is figure out how to keep going? That's exactly where I found myself almost 2 years ago, staring down the barrel of my late father's will. I was 28 at the time, juggling long hours at an engineering firm in Dallas and living a life that, by all accounts, seemed perfectly fine. But fine is just another word for empty, isn't it? I grew up in a small town, one of those places where everybody knows your name and what kind of pie your grandma brings to the church bake sale. My parents, Sarah and David, were the kind of couple people looked up to, hardworking, honest, and deeply in love. Mom had this way of making everyone around her feel seen. She was a nurse, which fit her nurturing nature like a glove. I can still hear her voice sometimes, gentle and soothing, calling me in for dinner or cheering me on at Little League games. Dad, on the other hand, was the strong, silent type. He wasn't much for words, but when he spoke, you listened. He worked construction most of his life, building houses and dreaming about one day owning a piece of land where he could retire and live simply. He used to talk about it when I was a kid, sitting on the porch of a small farmhouse, watching the sun set over his own land. Back then, it sounded like one of those vague ideas parents toss around to keep themselves motivated. But looking back, I think it was the one thing he truly wanted. Things changed 5 years ago. I was 25, still living in the city, trying to climb the corporate ladder when I got the call. My mom had been in a car accident on her way home from work. By the time I reached the hospital, it was already too late. Losing her felt like someone had ripped the floor out from under me. She'd been the glue that held us together, and without her, Dad and I didn't really know how to talk to each other anymore. I buried myself in work after that. It was easier than dealing with the grief, easier than facing my dad's quiet sadness. While I was pulling 12-hour days in the city, he sold the house I grew up in and bought the ranch he'd always dreamed about. 12 acres of rolling hills, a creek running through the back, and an old farmhouse that had seen better days. I only visited a handful of times. I told myself I was too busy, but the truth is, being around him felt like staring into a mirror I wasn't ready to face. He'd lost the love of his life, and I was too scared to admit how much I'd lost too. A year and a half ago, I got another call, this time from the neighbor who'd found him. A heart attack, they said. Quick and unexpected. I hadn't even known he had heart problems. The last time I'd seen him was 2 weeks earlier, and he'd been standing on the porch, waving me off as I drove away. I can't remember if I said, "I love you." Maybe I did, but maybe I didn't, and that thought still keeps me up some nights. When I sat in the lawyer's office, listening to the reading of the will, I felt numb. Dad had left everything to me. The ranch, the old truck, even his dog, a scrappy mutt named Bear. I didn't know the first thing about running a ranch, and part of me wanted to sell it off and move on. But then I thought about him, how much this place had meant to him, how it was his dream. Selling it felt like letting him down all over again. So, I packed up my life in Dallas and moved out to the middle of nowhere, hoping I could figure it out as I went along. The farmhouse was a mess when I moved in. Years of wear and tear, combined with Dad's habit of fixing things with duct tape and prayers, had left it in rough shape. The roof leaked, the porch sagged, and the inside smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. But it had good bones, as Dad would have said, and I decided to start small. The first thing I tackled was the garden. My mom loved flowers, and our yard growing up had always been bursting with color. Roses, daisies, marigolds, you name it. I figured planting a small garden might help me feel closer to her. So I cleared out a patch near the house and started digging. I had no idea what I was doing, but there was something satisfying about working with my hands, about seeing the progress day by day. Next, I started exploring the land. The ranch was beautiful in a way I hadn't appreciated before. Rolling hills covered in wild grass, clusters of trees that provided shade in the summer heat, and a creek that twisted and turned like it had a mind of its own. I found an old bench Dad had set up near the creek, and sitting there, I felt like I could almost hear him talking about all the plans he'd had for the place. The work was slow, but it felt good. I fixed the porch, patched up the roof, and even painted the farmhouse a fresh coat of white. Bear, my dad's dog, followed me everywhere, his tail wagging like he was just happy to have company. Slowly but surely, the ranch started to feel less like a burden and more like a place I could call home. It wasn't just the physical work that helped, it was the quiet. Out here, there were no traffic jams, no constant emails or phone calls demanding my attention. Just the sound of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional bark from bear. It gave me time to think, to remember my parents, and to figure out who I wanted to be moving forward. The ranch became more than just a piece of land. It became a place where I could heal, where I could start to let go of the guilt and grief that had been weighing me down. One Sunday, I woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee, and stepped out onto the porch to watch the sun rise. The air was crisp and cool, and the sky was painted with shades of pink and orange. Bear trotted up to me, his tail wagging, and I gave him a scratch behind the ears before heading to the garden. I'd planted a mix of flowers and vegetables, and they were finally starting to thrive. The sight of bright blossoms and rows of green shoots filled me with a quiet sense of pride. I knelt down to pull a few weeds, letting my thoughts wander as I worked. I thought about my mom and how much she would have loved the garden, about my dad and the dream he'd finally achieved, even if he didn't get to enjoy it for long. I thought about how far I'd come since moving here, about how this place had started to feel less like a reminder of loss and more like a tribute to the people who'd shaped me. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled me out of my thoughts. I looked up to see a sleek black BMW pulling into the driveway, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see the driver. My first thought was that they must be lost. No one in a car like that would have any reason to be out here. But as the engine shut off and the driver's side door opened, I felt a knot of unease form in my stomach. Whoever they were, they weren't here by accident. A woman stepped out, tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored navy blazer and heels that looked about as out of place on the ranch as a cow in a cocktail bar. Her blonde hair was pinned back into a perfect twist, and she carried a leather bag that screamed money. Everything about her looked polished, calculated. She didn't belong here. That much was clear. I straightened up, brushing the dirt off my hands and onto my jeans, and waited for her to speak. She took her time, adjusting her blazer and surveying the property like she was appraising it. Her gaze lingered on the farmhouse, the land, the garden, on everything but me. When she finally looked my way, her expression was one of faint disapproval, as if she'd expected someone a little more presentable. "You must be Brian," she said, her voice cool and clipped. "Yeah," I replied, crossing my arms. "And you are?" "Susan," she said, as if the name alone was supposed to mean something to me. When I didn't react, she added, "Susan Harrington. I was close with your father." That caught my attention. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, she glanced back at the farmhouse. "It's strange being here again," she said, her voice softening for a moment. "I haven't been back since. Well, since David passed." Hearing her say his name like that, so casually, like she had any right to, made my stomach tighten. I didn't know who this woman was or what she wanted, but I already didn't like where this was going. "Look, Susan," I said, keeping my voice even, "if you're selling something, I'm not interested. If you're here for something else, you might want to get to the point." Her expression hardened, the faint smile she'd been wearing vanishing in an instant. "I'm not here to sell anything," she said. "I'm here because this ranch rightfully belongs to me." I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh or say it was a joke, but she just stood there, her chin lifted slightly, like she was daring me to challenge her. "I think you've got the wrong address," I said. "This ranch belonged to my dad. Now it belongs to me." Susan's eyes narrowed. "Your father and I were in a relationship," she said. "After your mother passed, we became very close. He proposed to me not long before his death, and he promised me this ranch would be ours." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. My dad? In a relationship? With this woman? It didn't make sense. He'd never mentioned her, not once. "That's impossible," I said finally. "My dad didn't tell me anything about you." Her smile returned, but this time it was cold and condescending. "I'm not surprised. He said you two weren't very close after your mother passed." Her words stung, and I felt a flash of anger rising in my chest. Even if that's true, I said, the ranch was left to me in his will. There's nothing you can say that changes that. Susan reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder. From it, she produced a handful of photos, holding them out for me to see. I hesitated but took them. The first was of her and my dad, sitting on what looked like a restaurant patio, smiling at the camera. The second was of him holding her hand, a small velvet box in the other. My stomach turned as I flipped through the pictures. Evidence of a life he'd kept hidden from me. He loved me, Susan said, her voice trembling slightly now, though her composure didn't waver. We were building a future together. He promised me this ranch. I handed the photos back, my jaw tight. A verbal promise doesn't override a legal will. This ranch is mine. Her confident mask cracked, and her tone turned sharp. You're going to regret this, Brian, she snapped. This ranch isn't yours. It's ours. And I'll make sure the law sees it that way. I thought she'd leave after that. Most people would have taken the hint, maybe yelled a few parting insults before storming off. Not Susan. She pulled out her phone, stepped away from me, and started dialing. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered, watching her pace back and forth near her car. When she started speaking, her voice was loud enough for me to hear every word. Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser on my property, she said. He's refusing to leave and becoming aggressive. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Aggressive? I hadn't even raised my voice. This woman was out of her mind. Fine, I said, pulling out my own phone. Two can play this game. When the 911 operator answered, I explained the situation as calmly as I could, emphasizing that I was the legal owner of the ranch and that I had the paperwork to prove it. By the time I hung up, I could hear the faint wail of sirens in the distance. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. 3 cruisers pulling up one after the other, their lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out first, one a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, the other a younger woman who looked like she was still getting used to the job. The third stayed by his car, watching from a distance. Susan wasted no time rushing over to them, her voice carrying as she recounted her version of events. I stayed where I was, leaning against the porch railing, waiting my turn. When the older officer approached me, I handed him the will and property deeds I'd grabbed from the house. This is the legal documentation, I said. My father left the ranch to me. She has no claim to it. The officer looked over the papers, nodding slowly. This seems pretty clear-cut, he said. But let me talk to her again. When he returned to Susan, she was holding up the photos, her voice raised as she insisted the ranch had been promised to her. The officer listened patiently, but when she was done, he shook his head. Ma'am, he said, a verbal promise isn't legally binding. If you believe you have a legitimate claim, you'll need to take it to court. For now, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Susan's face turned red with anger. This isn't over, she hissed, glaring at me as she got back into her car. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. She wasn't bluffing. A week later, I was served with papers. Susan was suing me for the ranch, claiming that my father's verbal promises and their relationship entitled her to it. The next few months were a blur of legal meetings and sleepless nights. My lawyer, a sharp but compassionate woman named Maria, assured me we had a strong case. The will is clear, she said, and unless she has some kind of ironclad evidence, there's no way a judge will rule in her favor. Still, the stress was overwhelming. Susan's lawyer painted a picture of her as a devoted partner who had supported my dad through his grief. They presented photos, text messages, and even a few witnesses who testified to their relationship. It was hard to listen to, especially when Susan broke down crying on the stand, talking about how much she'd loved him. When it was my turn to testify, I focused on the facts. The will, the property deeds, and my dad's long-standing dream of passing the ranch down to me. Maria argued that while Susan's feelings were understandable, they didn't hold legal weight. The will was the final word. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally ruled in my favor. The relief was overwhelming, but it was bittersweet. I'd won, but the process had dredged up so many emotions I wasn't ready to face. Even after the case was closed, I couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. Susan's claims had forced me to see a side of my father I'd never known. A man who had loved again, who had found comfort in someone else after losing my mom. I didn't know whether to feel angry at him for keeping it a secret or sad for the struggles he must have faced. The ranch had given me space to heal, but there were still parts of me I couldn't quite put back together on my own. The anger, the guilt, the questions about my father's choices. All of it lingered, quietly weighing me down. I wasn't sure where to go with it, but one thing I did know was that my mom had always found peace in her faith. Growing up, she'd been the one dragging us to church every Sunday, humming hymns as she cooked breakfast. After she passed, I'd stopped going, unwilling to sit in the same pew where I used to see her smile. But now, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I found myself stepping back into that world. First, it was awkward. I'd sit in the back row, slipping in just as the service started and leaving before anyone could stop me for small talk. But week by week, I found myself drawn in. The pastor's words seemed to speak directly to me. Sermons about forgiveness, grace, and learning to let go of burdens you weren't meant to carry alone. It was like he knew exactly what was on my mind, and I started to feel a sense of relief I hadn't realized I was searching for. After a while, I started to get more involved. I joined a Bible study group, where I was surprised to find a group of people who listened without judgment. I volunteered for community service projects, helping rebuild homes damaged by storms and organizing food drives for families in need. Something about the act of giving back felt right, like it was pulling me closer to the person I wanted to be. My faith deepened, and so did my sense of purpose. For the first time since my parents died, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was growing. One Sunday morning, I was settling into my usual spot in the back row when I caught sight of someone who didn't quite blend in with the crowd. It was Susan. At first, I thought I must be seeing things, but then she turned, and there was no mistaking it. Her sharp, polished demeanor was gone, replaced by something softer. She looked different, less like someone who belonged in a courtroom and more like someone who was searching for something just like I had been. She didn't see me at first, and I considered slipping out before the service ended. But curiosity kept me rooted to my seat. What was she doing here? Was this some kind of stunt? I couldn't imagine her walking into a place like this unless she had a reason. When the service ended, I lingered near the door, watching as she spoke briefly with the pastor before heading my way. My heart pounded as she approached, but I kept my face neutral, unsure of what to expect. "Brian," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine. There was no edge to her voice this time, no trace of the combative woman who'd stormed onto my ranch months ago. "Do you have a moment to talk?" I hesitated but nodded. "Sure." We stepped outside, the warm sunlight filtering through the trees as we stood a few feet apart. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Susan took a deep breath and began. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A big one. I've had a lot of time to think about everything that happened, and I was wrong. About how I handled things. About everything." Her voice wavered, and she looked down at her hands. "I let my grief and anger get the better of me. Losing your father, David, it broke something in me, and instead of dealing with it the right way, I tried to take it out on you. I'm so sorry, Brian." I stared at her, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. This wasn't the Susan I remembered. This wasn't the woman who'd called the police on me or dragged me to court. This was someone who had been humbled, someone who was trying to make amends. She continued, her voice trembling. "I've been coming to this church for a few months now, trying to find peace. The pastor's been helping me, and I've been praying for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, not after everything I did to you, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me, the anger I'd been holding on to, the resentment towards Susan, the frustration with my father. It all felt like it was rising to the surface. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, to ask her why she thought she had any right to ask for my forgiveness after everything she'd put me through. But instead, I thought about the pastor's sermons, about grace, about letting go. "I forgive you," I said quietly, the words feeling heavier than I expected. Susan looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Really?" she whispered. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "Not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to this isn't helping either of us. I don't want to carry this around anymore." Tears filled her eyes, and she nodded. "Thank you. You have no idea what that means to me." For the first time we talked, not as adversaries, but as two people who had loved the same man in different ways. Susan shared stories about my father I'd never heard before, how they'd met, how he'd struggled to move on after my mom's death, and how she tried to help him find happiness again. It was painful to hear, but it also gave me a new perspective. My dad wasn't perfect. He was human, and in his own flawed way, he'd been trying to find peace, just like I was. After that conversation, something shifted. The resentment I'd been carrying started to fade, replaced by a sense of understanding. I couldn't change the past, but I could honor my father's memory by making the ranch a place where others could find the peace he'd been searching for. I started opening the ranch to the church community, hosting small gatherings, prayer retreats, and fellowship events. The garden became a favorite spot for quiet reflection, and the old barn was transformed into a space for Bible studies and youth group meetings. Seeing the ranch come alive with people laughing, praying, and connecting filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The church community became like a second family to me. They supported me through the ups and downs, reminding me that I wasn't alone. And in giving the ranch to them, I felt like I was giving back not just to the people around me, but to my parents' legacy.